Good afternoon, and welcome to the workshop on subsidiarity and decentralization for sustainable development, as well as the launch of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration SIPA guidance notes on the principle of subsidiarity. I am Anna Torlund, a governance and public administration expert at UNDESA DPIDG Project Office on Governance. This webinar is recorded, and all presentations will be made available at the workshop event at unpog.org. All participants are muted by default and video has been disabled. For today's moderated session, we will use the Zoom Q&A function to address your questions. Please click the Q&A icon in the bottom of menu and type your question, including the speaker's name. There are 1,600 participants registered for this webinar, and we are mainstreaming in our YouTube channel live. Allow me to introduce our moderator, Dr. Ronald Mendoza, former Dean of the Ateneo de Manila University School of Governance and Government, and presently Senior Economist with the Ateneo Policy Center. Dr. Mendoza is a member of the UN Committee of Experts on Public Administration with an extensive background in international development, policy, and cooperation. Dr. Mendoza's resume includes work with the United Nations, the Asia Institute of Management, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He has advanced reforms aimed at improving human development, reducing poverty, and foster more inclusive economic and political development. Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much to our colleagues for joining us today. It is a pleasure for me and an honor to serve as moderator for this workshop and launch of these notes. Part of my role is to give a brief background first of the workshop and revisit our main workshop objectives. So here goes. The Committee of Experts on Public Administration adopted 11 principles of effective governance at its 17th session. The principles endorsed by the Economic and Social Council in its resolution highlight the need for pragmatic and ongoing improvements in national and local governance capabilities to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The principles are designed to ensure effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions for sustainable development at all levels. One of these principles is the principle of subsidiarity. To promote government that is responsive to the needs and aspirations of all people, central authorities should perform only those tasks which cannot be performed effectively at a more immediate or local level. SEPA has identified 5 commonly used strategies for promoting subsidiarity, namely fiscal federalism and decentralization, strengthening urban governance, strengthening municipal finance and local finance systems, enhancement of local capacity for prevention, adaptation, and mitigation of external shocks, and lastly, multi-level governance. Based on the principles of subsidiarity from the UN SEPA Principles of Effective Governance, UNDESA, together with its Project Office on Governance, is organizing this session that we are having today in order to discuss these topics. The workshop is intended to benefit policymakers at central, regional, and local levels, particularly in developing countries. So once again, thank you to all colleagues who have joined us today. I see on my indicator here close to 300 already signed in. So without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our first speaker and begin with our workshop itself. So our first speaker is Mr. Navid Hanif, Assistant Secretary General, UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Mr. Hanif is the Assistant Secretary General for Economic and Department of Economic Social Affairs in DESA, and he is also the UN Sherpa to the G20 Finance and Main Tracks. He joined UNDESA in 2001, and he was a Senior Policy Advisor in the Division for Sustainable Development and a member of the team for the World Summit on Sustainable Development held in Johannesburg in 2002. He served as the Chief of Policy Coordination Branch and later Director in the Office for Economic and Social Council Support and the Director for Financing for Sustainable Development Office. He was the first head of the DESA Strategic Planning Unit established in 2010. He was Principal Officer in the Office of the United Nations Secretary General, Vice Chair of the UN High-Level Committee on Programming, and co-coordinator of the UN team on repositioning of the UN development system that led to major reforms in 2018. He has since contributed several articles on financing and investing in the SDGs in various journals and major reports. He holds MIA International Political Economy at Columbia University and an MA in English Literature from the Government College University, Lahore. Without further ado, let me turn over to Mr. Hanif.
Distinguished participants, resident coordinators, colleagues, on behalf of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual workshop on subsidiarity, one of the UN principles of effective governance for sustainable development. These were developed by the Committee of Experts on Public Administration that we call CEPA. I wish to commend the organizing team in the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government and its United Nations project on governance for hosting this virtual workshop with a focus on strengthening capacities of subnational authorities for SDG implementation in the Asia-Pacific region. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the principle of subsidiarity, central authorities should perform only those tasks which cannot be performed effectively at the intermediate or local level. To reach its transformative potential, the 2030 Agenda must be realized at the local level. Subnational governments play a pivotal role in the implementation of most SDGs and their targets. Everyday experiences make it clear that food security, access to quality education and healthcare, clean water and sanitation, sustainable cities and communities, and much more depend on the presence of capable local authorities and on constructive engagement with national governments. Districts, cities, towns, and villages are closer to the level where policies are more likely to produce measurable, transparent, and responsive results. According to OECD estimates, 65% of the 169 targets underlying the SDGs will not be achieved without proper engagement of and coordination with local and subnational governments. The 2023 Political Declaration, adopted by the General Assembly in September, reiterates the promise of the 2030 Agenda, noting that integrated planning and implementation of the SDGs needs to take place at the local level. I wish to highlight three aspects. First, localizing the SDGs is not limited to integrating the goals into local development plans. Local communities, being closest to the ground, are also better positioned to monitor and hold decision makers accountable. Participation, inclusion, stakeholder engagement, and a whole of society approach, including the full involvement of civil society, local organizations, and the private sector, is imperative in successful localization efforts. Second, SDG localization is one of the 12 high-impact initiatives showcased at the 2023 SDG Summit. Participants at the SDG Action Weekend stressed that local and regional governments play a pivotal role in promoting partnerships between communities and spheres of government and have much to contribute across United Nations initiatives. Third, as some of you know, UNDESA has produced a set of guidance notes to support operationalization of the principle of subsidiarity. These will be introduced here today. We hope you find them useful as reference documents for strengthening local authorities and their collective efforts to implement the SDGs. The guidance notes examine the economic benefits of decentralizing appropriate public sector functions and finances to subnational levels of government, including through subnational owned resource revenues, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, and subnational government borrowing. Strengthening public financial management systems at local levels can ensure that revenues and expenditures are aligned in a way that allow for fiscal discipline and the efficient allocation of resources in the pursuit of sustainable development outcomes. How local governments plan, manage, and finance urban areas determines what happens in towns and cities, how well they function, and the quality of life and services enjoyed by the people who live and work in these spaces. Local capacity to prevent and mitigate external shocks reduces the incidence of larger scale hazards. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, global crises have local dimensions and require localized responses. The lingering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and other global crises that we see has starkly shown the need for tailored, context-specific approaches to address diverse impacts on communities. I trust you will find this virtual workshop on the principle of subsidiarity useful, and I hope that it helps you in identifying concrete actions that can support subnational authorities in your country while keeping local government at the heart of the 2030 Agenda implementation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General Navid Hanif. I understand that before we formally begin the workshop discussions, we're supposed to have a brief photo opportunity with the colleagues who will be joining us. So if you could turn on your videos, please. Go ahead, Anna.
Thank you, Stan.
Very good. Thank you so much, everyone. So without further ado, let us start with the first presentation. I have the honor to introduce our first speaker, who is Honorable Romina Khurshid Alam. And I hope she's safely traveling. As I saw, she is in a car right now, but still going to join us for the workshop. She is a second-time parliamentarian who holds vast experience in activating parliamentary caucuses and forums. During the course of time, she has been an enthusiastic member of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus, as well as the Young Parliamentarians Forum. She was the former convener for the National Parliamentary Task Force on SDGs, and she's spearheading this cross-party and volunteer forum with her utmost dedication and untiring efforts. Honorable Ramina Khurshid Alam is also an active member of various standing committees, where she plays the crucial role of a thorough legislator. During her time, she has laid and generated significant legislation and ensured robust oversight using parliamentary tools. Along with these critical responsibilities, she has been tasked to serve the incumbent government as Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on Political Affairs with the status of State Minister. It is my pleasure to open the workshop by inviting Honorable Alam to begin her intervention.
Thank you very much, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening across the world, wherever everyone is listening to me. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to being the part of this very learned workshop, and I believe these sort of workshops led to a great support and help for each other, where we can learn a lot from each other's best practices. Getting back to the subject, of course, I'm sure everybody is here. I think when we talk about SDGs, for me, SDGs is, of course, something which is more towards like great need of a life, a quality life, where every citizen, everyone, every either living and of course life underwater, and every has a right to live in a right and way. But nowadays, as we have seen, the way the life is moving very quickly and the urbanization is developing a lot, I think where we talk about the local governance, nothing can be done without that. We need to work great on it, and I think these sort of forums can play a great pivotal role. So I believe that urban governance refers to the mechanism, process, and structure through which cities and urban areas are managed and governed. It involves the coordination and administration of various functions, services, and resources within and an urban environment to ensure sustainable development, effective service delivery, and the overall well-being of resident. Of course, when we talk about the urban governance, that is a wide range of activities and responsibilities, including planning, infrastructure development, public service, environmental management, and social inclusions. As nowadays, Pakistan, along with few other neighboring countries, we are suffering a great challenge of smog as well, and that is, of course, somehow related to the urban governance as well. When we talk about urban governance, I think it's a play a critical role in achieving sustainable development goals in urban areas. Sustainable development in holistic approach that seeks to meet the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In the context of urban areas, sustainable development involves addressing environmental, social, and economic challenges to create cities that are resilient, inclusive, and environmentally responsible. Urban planning that involves, can you hear me?
Yes, we do. Now,
Okay,
now
fine.
we can see you also.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I got a message of Anna, so I just tried to switch on the camera. So I hope you can see me now.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
you.
So fine. So publics, like in the local governance, local governments play, of course, a very crucial role in what governance. They are responsible for implementing the policies, delivering the services, and addressing the needs of the local community. And I believe that if we really want to get the things like to everybody to get their rights and to give them a healthy and a prosperous life, I think for that we need to have a proper mechanism, especially in the policy, because we have to involve in every aspect of life into the local governance system. And when we talk about the infrastructure development, urban governance involves planning, as I've already said, in maintaining infrastructure such as needs and bridges, public spaces, utilities to support the needs of the growing urban population. And of course, we should definitely think about the urban forestation, which can play a great part as well. So if we talk about the environmental management, so because in the cities, we are facing so much environmental challenges, including pollution, waste management, and climate change. Urban governance includes definitely efforts of to mitigate environmental impact and promote sustainability through policies and practice. So in social inclusions and energy, urban governance should address issues of social inequality and exclusions. This involves promoting inclusivity, equal access to the opportunities, and addressing the needs of marginalized communities. So policy, when we talk about the policy makers, of course, I believe that it's very important that we should come up with a formulation and implementation of in a way of policies to address the unique challenges and opportunities of urban areas, be essential for effective in a way to come up with all the solutions and to engage moreover with. So when we talk about the technology integration, the use of technology such as smart city solutions, data analysis, and digital platform can enhance the efficiency of urban governance by improving service delivery, infrastructure management of communications. Effective urban governance is crucial for creating livable and sustainable, resilient cities. So it requires, of course, a holistic approach, and of course, by these sort of workshops, I believe that we can come up with the success stories, and we can come up with the policies or some way of a toolkit, as the worthy speaker before me who spoke the way he was talking about the toolkit. So I believe by getting engaged with each other, by using each other good practices, we can talk. So now just in a quickly, I just wanted to let you know about the urban governance in Pakistan, which sort of challenges we are facing. So in urban governance in Pakistan faces a variety of challenges and opportunities, reflecting the country's rapid urbanization and the complexities associated with the managing urban areas. Several key aspects of urban governance in Pakistan include rapid urbanization. Pakistan has experienced significant urbanization in recent years, with a growing percentage of the population residing in urban areas. The very rapid increase of people, they are migrating from rural to urban. The rapid urbanization has strained existing infrastructure, services, and governance system. Local government structure, the structure of local government in Pakistan has undergone changes over the years, with varying degrees of decentralization. Local government institutions play a crucial role in urban governance, and their effectiveness can impact service delivery and development outcomes. So infrastructure development, urban areas in Pakistan often faces challenges related to inadequate water supply, sanitation, and waste management. Smog, a big challenge again, what I'm telling you. And then housing and informal settlements, the profilation of informal settlement and inadequate housing is a significant issue in many Pakistani cities. So urban governance needs to address the housing needs of the urban population, improving living condition in informal settlement, and promote affordable housing options. So and same goes with environmental challenge. Pakistan cities grapple with environmental issues such as air and water pollution, waste management, and vulnerability to climate change. And then public service, ensuring the effective efficient delivery of public service, including healthcare, education, and social service, is a crucial, very crucial for the well-being of urban residents. So traffic and transportation, that is again a very big challenge, like other countries, like traffic congestion and indicate public transportation are a common issues, I'm sure, in other countries, same as we are having in Pakistan as well. So urban governance should, of course, I believe that work towards sustainable and efficient transportation system to ease congestion and improve the mobility. So development within when areas I got to know that I just had left with 1 minute. So I just wanted to believe it, just to sum up in a way, I think the most important is to do the community engagement, involving the communities in decision-making process is very much essential for success of the urban governance. Community participation can enhance the effectiveness of the policies and projects for fostering a sense of ownership and collaboration. Despite these challenges, Pakistan has also seen positive initiatives and reforms. For instance, the Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province has implemented a local government system and aimed to implement a local government system aimed at decentralization and empowering local communities. Additional, the National District Disaster Management Plan in Pakistan address urban resilience and disaster management. In last, the effectiveness of urban governance in Pakistan depends on the collaborative efforts of government institutions, local communities, and stakeholders. In just very last few seconds I'll take, and I just wanted to say that these sort of workshops where we all sit together and we come up with our issues and the best practices, I think by making a small sort of working groups to help each other and to come up with the solutions as a region wise, that could be a great support. Because some of the times we try to come up with every issues, but when it comes to solution, I believe every region has a different solution for every region. So in the end, thank you so very much, UNDZ, and once again all the team of UNDZ for this all great workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Honorable Romina Khurshid Alam. We know you're very busy and you are actually in a car right now, probably headed somewhere. You have mentioned issues such as resilient cities, inclusive infrastructure, and of course, the important element of community engagement. Thank you so much for sharing your
My
thoughts.
pleasure. My pleasure. Always a great pleasure, and always there for work and support. Thanks, Anna.
Okay, safe travels, ma'am. Without further ado, let me turn over to the next speaker. I'm honored to introduce you to Governor Dakila Carlo Dax Kua, who is the newly elected governor of Quirino Province in the Philippines. Having served for 9 years as congressman, 6 years as vice governor, and 6 years as governor, he has broad experience in the executive and legislative branches of government. Governor Kua graduated from the University of the Philippines, earning a bachelor's degree in business administration. And throughout his career in public service, he has focused on raising the quality of life of Filipinos. He prioritizes health and education to allow Filipinos to participate in economic activities, infrastructure to move goods and services, and improve information and communication technology, and agriculture and livelihood to increase household income. As a legislator, he was the principal author of Train Law and the author of the Rice Tarification Law and the Ease of Doing Business Act and Philippine Competition Law in the Philippines. Recently, he was elected as National President of the Union of Local Authorities of the Philippines and National Chairman for League of Provinces of the Philippines, and the umbrella organization of all the leagues of local government units and elected local officials in the country. So here to speak about some of his experiences in local governance, I turn you over to Governor Dax Kua.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed delegates, distinguished guests, partners from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and fellow leaders in public administration. I am Dax Kua from the Union of Local Authorities of the Philippines, or ULAP, and I am deeply honored to be with you today to talk about subsidiarity and decentralization for sustainable development. These are two powerful concepts that, when implemented effectively, can unlock the full potential of our communities and help us achieve a brighter, more sustainable future. Subsidiarity and decentralization are concepts very close to our hearts in ULAP and at the local government level. In fact, whenever we encounter rigid mandates that stifle the creativity and ability of local government units to design and build the futures that their constituents desire and deserve, we firmly champion the principles of decentralization and subsidiarity. While we acknowledge the need for certain defined parameters within which local autonomy operates, these boundaries should never unduly restrict the creativity and initiatives of local government units. We must embrace the undeniable truth, as I often say, that the future is local. This statement encapsulates the fundamental principle that effective local governance transcends mere administrative delegation. It demands the conferral of real authority upon LGUs to make decisions that profoundly impact the lives of their communities. Instead of viewing LGUs as subordinate entities, we must recognize them as partners of the national government in achieving shared national development goals. This collaborative approach empowers local governments to utilize their unique knowledge and understanding of their communities to craft solutions that are tailored to their specific needs and aspirations. By fostering such a partnership, we unlock the full potential of local leadership and unleash the collective creativity of our communities. While the UN's SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, aim for a better future by 2030, the Philippines faces challenges exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. A Sustainable Development Report places us 95th globally, with progress mainly in SDG number 12 only. Realizing the magnitude of the work that has to be done, accelerated efforts to bolster the country's performance must be done immediately. Key to these accelerated efforts are our local government units. Ultimately, the local government units are the ones who bear the brunt of implementing SDG programs and achieving SDG targets. And by aligning national priorities with regional and local plans, empowering local government units, and mainstreaming SDGs into mainstream investments, involving all stakeholders and addressing unique challenges and opportunities, we can ultimately accelerate progress towards the SDGs. Your ULAP's push is to identify the enumeration of the essential services that each level of local government could provide, and then come up with a data-driven service delivery unique to the needs, goals, and aspirations of each local government. As an illustration, if we are to accelerate efforts towards SDG goal number 2, or zero hunger, which is one of the SDGs in the Philippines that is facing serious challenges, we have to be able to identify the following. First, what services offered and programs and activities implemented by the government addresses hunger, including which services are geared towards improving access to food, ending all forms of malnutrition, improving agricultural productivity, increasing investments, and ensuring the proper functioning of food commodity markets and their derivatives. Next, we have to identify which level of government must be responsible for delivering these services or implementing these programs, and how each level of local government could complement or supplement one another. Third, if we have to identify which local government units need these services most, so that we can concentrate government and private efforts and resources on these areas, it is reasonable that efforts be focused on identified regions to accelerate efforts towards zero hunger. And as we continue to discuss subsidiarity and decentralization for sustainable development, I cannot overemphasize that the future is local. In a world increasingly dominated by globalization, where decisions are often made thousands of miles away from the communities they affect, or goals are set in global arena, we have to realize that ultimately we have to listen to the local governments, empower local governments and local communities, leverage local knowledge, and prioritize local resources to shape our destinies. By prioritizing local needs and understanding, we can pave a path toward truly sustainable growth, rather than one-size-fits-all solutions from global entities that might not understand or not appropriate or prioritize local nuances. We have to be able to finally adopt this approach in our country very soon to empower local government units to contribute to national and global development. The realization of these sustainable development goals rests largely on local government units. We can create a more sustainable and inclusive future for the people. Let us work together across sectors and borders to build a better world for generations to come. Again, I'm Dax Kua from ULAP. Thank you and mabuhay po.
Thank you very much, Governor Dax, for those very interesting thoughts and obviously for sharing your leadership experiences. The motto of the future is local is an important one, and it is showing in your presentation as well as your leadership experiences in the Philippines. I noticed that there are a number of questions raised on the chat box, and our colleagues in UNDESA are answering most of them, if not all of them. And rest assured that if they are unable to provide some of the answers, they will be directed to the relevant speaker in due course so that your questions can be answered. One question has to do with a copy of the presentations, and I believe that our colleagues in UNDESA already shared the link for this. So thank you very much. So let me now turn to the next presenter. Mr. Tapan Mishra took over his role as Mongolia's United Nations Resident Coordinator in September of 2019, and as UNRC, the highest-ranking representative of the United Nations Development System in Mongolia, he has been designated by the UN Secretary-General to lead the UN country team in coordinating operational activities for development in the country. Before his post in Mongolia, Mr. Mishra served as UNRC in DPR Korea from 2015 to 2019, and he first joined the UN system in 2003 as the UNDP Learning Advisor and Deputy Chief of the Learning Resources Center in the Office of Human Resources, Bureau of Management, where he moved up to become the Director and Chief of LRC from 2007 to 2013. Thereafter, he served on numerous assignments as Senior Advisor at the Business Solutions Exchange, supporting country offices as well as offices in headquarters, including the Human Development Report Office and the Bureau of Policy and Program Support till 2015, when he was appointed as UNRC. Let me call on Mr. Mishra to now share some of his thoughts on the topic at hand. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ronald Mendoza, for a very warm welcome and for the introduction. Thank Anna, Praveen, and colleagues in UNDESA, Project Office and Governance, for the invitation. And I'm delighted to join you on this virtual workshop on subsidiarity and decentralization for sustainable development. And greetings to all our participants all over the world. Let me first share some important facets of the Mongolian context to enable us to understand the issues of governance and sustainable development. As you may know, that Mongolia is a young democracy, a young market economy that was initiated in the early 90s and after transition from a socialist form of government. And in the 30-odd years of this young, vibrant, and dynamic democracy that I call it, there has been about 18 or 19 changes in government. And the average age of governments have been less than 2 years. However, now the current government, which is formed under the Mongolian People's Party, has been in office for about six years, which is the longest period in the history of Mongolia. Now, Mongolia also has a huge landmass, about 1.53 million square kilometers, landlocked between neighboring giants of Russia in the north and China in the south, but a very small population of 3.45 million, which is spread over 21 provinces and 360 sums or villages. But close to half the population, almost 47% and about 1.63 million, live in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar, especially due to the internal migration from rural to urban in response to natural disasters, especially Zood, which is a climatic disaster where the herders lose their livestock and livelihoods, and they, in search of their livelihoods, move to the capital city. So in this challenge, we have also a propensity of the government to have centralized governance, primarily due to lack of capacity and inadequate resources at the local level. The policy, legal, and regulatory framework for local government is sometimes unclear or inconsistent, and usually not translated into clear operational guidance, although there are the local governments at every one of the 21 IMOs or 21 provinces, and the SUMs and BUGs, they all have governors, and there's a whole process there, but sometimes perhaps it's not adequately capacitated. Financing and budgeting arrangements, despite the reforms of the new budget law, constitute limitation, impeding local decision making. That is the rationale for decentralization. And most IMOs do rely on subsidies from the central government and no incentives for local authorities for local actions. And there is limited scope for having the local taxes by the limitations of the law. Due to this low expectations of responsibilities and accountabilities in the local government, the capacity of local governments have been weakened throughout this last 30 years that I've talked about. The economies of scale for these provinces or IMOs or SUMs and villages are small. The residents in the provinces range from 40 to 100,000, and in the SUM or the village is about 2 to 3,000. And therefore, there's a challenge in terms of these capacities to really independently manage those priorities them. And also the budget allocation for these local provinces is very much politicized. Now, let me talk about the possibilities and the opportunities that the government is now looking forward to. The government of Mongolia, as I said, has a longer term vision, Vision 2050, which is beyond the scope of the 2030 agenda or the SDGs. And we're looking together as a full alignment between the two. And the government is looking towards having an integrated comprehensive policy for effective development planning for both, including regional and rural development, to reduce rural and urban disparities. The government does have limited capacity and resources to invest in all the provinces at the same time, and therefore it is going to prioritize and improving value chains and addressing bottlenecks can unleash the economic potential and generate the employment in rural areas. Rural economies are often built around specific industries such as primarily agriculture or agro-processing, tourism, transportation, logistics, etc., and seeks to optimize every step of the value chain to create sustainable economic growth and improve livelihoods. Therefore, based on comparative advantages of the provinces, cities, governments can certainly prioritize investment in the top-ranking provinces and cities, and that's what we are looking at in this new direction of the sustainable development accelerators that we are working closely with the government on. With the relevant regulations, the government could also clarify the roles and responsibilities of the prioritized provinces and cities, such as first-rank provinces and cities, to have the multifunctional roles, serving as a regional economic and industrial cluster center and providing cultural, social, and logistic services for the region. Such provinces, cities can share the burden and the development pressure on the capital of the Ulaanbaatar city. And I will talk about a little bit on the urban governance a little later, but prioritized provinces, cities to have industrial hubs and other located provinces can be linked to the supplier of intermediary products, or because 85% of Mongolia's export is raw material, and we need to have value-added opportunities to really have products and services which are more value-added. And therefore, a more holistic approach and local economy could be enhanced. Through such phased policy interventions and investment priorities, economic opportunities will be created in prioritized provinces, cities, and towns, and people will have a choice to reverse the migration from rural to urban back to rural areas where development is going to happen. Now, the government is also seem to be very strongly positive, and there seems to be political will and commitment to make this happen. The government has clearly talked about enhancing efficiency, effectiveness, and transparency of the government performance, and is explicitly stated as a priority. Addressing corruption is openly discussed in the parliament and government priorities. And we have an institution called the National Academy of Governance, with whom we work in the UN and capacity building needs to effectively implement the principles of subsidiarity and decentralization for inclusive and sustainable development. The National Academy of Governance also started collaboration with the UN DESA, the Project Office on Governance in capacity building, and is looking forward to more support in terms of digital governance and data. and including training and digital management, which will enable more effective support towards subsidiarity and decentralization of governance. In effect, I would say that I think the time is ripe in a more stable environment when we have the close cooperation of the UN with the government and all of the stakeholders. We are working towards building capacity in the government, not only at the central level, but at the provincial and the rural levels, local levels, to really enable that capacity to have effective local governance, decentralization, and subsidiarity. That's the way forward. Obviously, as I've said, some of the challenges are about economies of scale, given the smaller population. Also, we are trying to address kind of the key challenges and capacity needs for the country. So that's where I would say that Mongolia has a huge potential. I see Mongolia as a possible role model for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals towards its progress towards the Vision 2050 that the government has as its aspiration from a long-term development policy perspective. And I see that looking at subsidiarity and local governance and decentralized governance is a key opportunity to really have more regional and rural development, decongest the capital. The capital is overpopulated, like our member of parliament from Pakistan was mentioning, that these challenges lead to traffic jams and overcrowding, lack of adequate supplies and facilities, including social services, etc. So although we can do through effective decentralization, also regional and rural development, that's the way forward. And working on governance side by side, economic development is the key. I would stop here, but let me answer some questions that are there in the chat. Ronald, I see some questions that I've asked by Anna to say. And a question from Nepal, I think Umesh has asked about the natural disasters. Mongolia does suffer from natural disasters also. We have a cyclic disaster called the Zood, where the acute temperatures go down to -30, -40, sometimes -50, and the livelihoods of the herders in the rural areas is affected, where their livestock are affected by those cold and due to starving, and they cannot withstand the climatic conditions. We also had floods recently, including in Ulaanbaatar city. So the question that Umesh asked is about, is it only natural disaster or is it man-made? And certainly there is a huge element of the man-made part, both in terms of aggravating those conditions. Like in the floods, we noticed that because of the bad management, waste management, and putting all these rubbish in the garbage in areas which congest the drainages and all that stuff, it aggravates the situation. Making the houses in low-lying areas can also accentuate the problem. And also not heeding to the early warnings and not taking preemptive action and anticipated action also aggravates the impact of these disasters. So certainly the role of people is highly accentuated in such disasters. And obviously government at the central level, at the national level, at the regional and local level can work closely together with the people and communities to work together and create enabling conditions for effectively dealing with these disasters. Let me stop here and get back to you, Ronald, if there are any other questions.
Thank you very much, Tapan. I think you touched on 2 or 3 of the key questions we wanted to raise as well. But I also noticed that you talked about an interesting innovation in Mongolia, which is the National Academy of Governance. If you would like to spend some more time explaining the work of that particular organization, it might be an inspiration for other countries sort of engaging in multi-level governance as well.
Thank you, Ronald. I've been in discussions with the director of the National Academy of Governance even before this virtual workshop to make sure that what I'm going to represent is adequately representing the government's situation and position on that. As I said, the National Academy of Governance is an institution reporting to the parliament, which enables effectiveness in the government. And the government of Mongolia has clearly stated its priority of ensuring effectiveness in governance through efficiency, effectiveness, transparency, addressing challenges of corruption. And this National Academy of Governance, which is plays a key role in building the capacity in that role, working with all the ministries and civil servants to ensure that these effectiveness, efficiency of the governance is ensured. we focus on supporting this academy through the capacity building at multiple levels. Our aspiration is to really work more beyond the central level or the national level to more sub-national levels at the province level and the SUM and BAG level as well. So that's where we are moving forward towards. And as I mentioned, that also in the historical past that Mongolia had, which is the socialist form of government, it was more centralized around the way of managing. And also given the challenges of the economies of scale, the number of people that are there. And as I said, half of the population of Mongolia is in the capital city, right? So because of livelihood reasons and economic reasons. But we are trying to create opportunities for people in this country to go back and find more decent jobs and livelihoods in rural areas and regional areas. And therefore, the capacities of governance at these regional levels will be need to be addressed. And therefore, the National Academy of Governance will have a key role to play. We're also working on the aspects of digital governance. We're leveraging digital transformation to enable this shift to happen, so that, because to make sure that governance is effective, we need to ensure that digital governance, which ensures effective offering of public services more efficiently and effectively, is also taken into. So therefore, institutions like this do play a very important role. And as the UN, together here in Mongolia, and with support from UNDESA and Project Office on Governance, we are trying our best to support the government and the National Academy to ensure that we do follow the principles of subsidiarity, decentralization, and enhancing the capacities of local governance to make inclusive and sustainable development a reality.
Thank you very much for that, Tapan. We are making good time, actually, thanks to the discipline of all our speakers, and of course, some are pre-recorded. Let me draw on this question, which has been shared with me by the organizers. Tapan, can you please shed some light on the possible fragilities in the infrastructure programs of Mongolia, based on your experience?
Certainly. As I was mentioning, if it's the context of Mongolia, is a huge landmass of 1.53 million square kilometers between two formidable economic and political giants of Russia in the north and China on the south. And the dependence of Mongolia on China for 85% of its exports and almost close to 60-70% of imports, including food and basic necessities, has been huge. The aspect of China having huge infrastructure in terms of their own capacities, including for processing the main produce of Mongolia, which is mining sector, the copper, coal, gold, and other minerals. Most of the processing is done by China. So investments in infrastructure has not been adequately addressed. In the previous socialist term, it was a more support from certain areas where infrastructure was invested. But in a new young democracy with a market economy, with smaller agencies, the infrastructure development has not been a huge priority because of lack of capacity. There was also the debt burden, which was inhibiting huge investments in infrastructure. But I think the government is getting slowly around that to really looking at the key needs of infrastructure, working with the IFIs of the World Bank, ADB, EBRD, and other, the Asia, AIIB, the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Development Bank. They're looking at all these possibilities to really enable the infrastructure needed for enabling achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and making sure that these investments of infrastructure are adequately meeting the needs of the people, including for value-added processing of raw materials, which has been perhaps the most important economic driver for Mongolia, to also create employment for youth and other marginalized groups and vulnerable groups through this investments. So certainly it's a big priority, but again, with the COVID pandemic, with the economic challenges of the social impact and economic impact, there has been some challenges. The economic situation is looking much better now, with the debt burden, the sword of Damocles that always hangs around coming to the brink of a debt disaster. I think Mongolia is considering a lot of foreign direct investments for infrastructure development as well. Have I answered your question, Ronald?
Yes, you have, Tapan, and thank you so much for sharing some more good news for Mongolia. I had the pleasure of working and visiting there some years back. study, working with government officials, how they could invest in children, some of their natural resource wealth. So it reflects some of what you have already talked about in terms of channeling some of these resources into the country's human capital as part of
Ronald,
that.
can I come in before we drop off? Since you talked about children,
Sure.
Mongolia is a young
Sure.
population. Again, it's a small population, and therefore the importance of the young population is almost more than 1/3. We're looking at children, and therefore with UNICEF and with other partners, we do invest in a lot of children. We are also taking long steps in transforming education as one of the priorities of the UN that we've been working on in the global summit. Mongolia also played a key role in spotlighting the aspects of digital transformation to enable transforming education. So certainly we look at the youth and the children as potential engines of change and development in inclusive and sustainable development going forward. And we at the UN do collectively work with the youth and children, including in schools and kindergartens, to activate them and engaging them in contributing towards inclusive and sustainable development. And they are the real wealth of a nation in every country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that good news, Tapan. I worked on that about a decade ago, so it's good to know that the initiative is still well and alive, and the policy priority to invest in Mongolia's children. So we have made good time, actually, thanks to Tapan and colleagues. So Tapan Mishra talked about basically multi-level governance and strengthening urban governance. Governor Dax talked about fiscal federalism and decentralization, and the fact that the future is local in terms of prioritizing decentralization as part of our development planning in the Philippines. And then, of course, Honorable Romina Khurshid Alam talked about strengthening urban governance, pushing for inclusion, engaging communities to try and strengthen ownership. So we've actually started very well with this workshop with a number of interventions from our esteemed speakers. And let me take this opportunity to thank them again for their participation. We encourage you to please file your questions on the chat box, which our colleagues in UNDESA are basically curating and will be directing to me as well as to the participants for some immediate reactions. And thank you to Tapan for he himself reacting to some of the questions already. And if we are unable to raise these many questions, I believe they're now piling up in the chat box. Rest assured that we will direct them to the relevant speaker and get you some engagement in that way. So that is the conclusion of the first session. And let me now try to stimulate the discussion on the second session, whose main focus is on strategies to operationalize the principles of subsidiarity. So now we move to the more technical side of the workshop. For the principles of subsidiarity, SEPA noted that to promote government that is responsive to the needs and aspirations of all people, central authorities should perform only those tasks which cannot be performed effectively at more intermediate or local level. SEPA identified 5 commonly used strategies, which I already mentioned earlier in the introduction to this workshop. But in the interest of revisiting some of these topics, since now we have about almost 400 participants, and we only started with almost 300 a while back. Let me note again these main issues, 5 commonly used strategies. Number 1, fiscal federalism and decentralization. Number 2, strengthening urban governance. Number 3, strengthening municipal finance and local finance systems. Number 4, enhancement of local capacity for prevention, adaptation, and mitigation of external shocks. And number 5, multi-level governance. And the first session already, we heard some very interesting insights on many of these aspects from these thought leaders that we invited to speak today. Now, these strategies are designed to assist with operationalization and implementation. So UNDESA has produced what they call strategy guidance notes, which have been written by global experts to assist with advice on implementation of these strategies. We are going to hear from some of them now. These are leading experts in their field who have also had the opportunity to tap into their global networks so that the notes that they prepared and which you will see online on the event website represent the collective knowledge of the top individuals in these fields of practice. So this is a tremendous wealth of resources now available for our colleagues worldwide. We hope that the notes will provide some clarity and way forward for those who want to pursue subsidiarity and localization of SDGs. Each note covers the topics of understanding the strategy, public sector situation and trends, and the methods of implementation. Each note also has a number of case studies which provide a few good practice examples, as well as countries that can find peer-to-peer learning and research and international development cooperation. We hope that altogether the notes provide a rich set of guidance and operationalization of the strategies for national and subnational actors wanting to implement the principle of subsidiarity. So without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker. Mr. Brian Roberts, or should I say Professor Brian Roberts, is an emeritus professor and an international urban management expert. Brian holds qualifications in land surveying, urban and regional planning, urban design and business management, as well as a PhD in urban and regional economic development. Brian has held senior positions with the United Nations Center for Human Settlements, Queensland State Government, 2 academic institutions, and within the consulting industry. Brian has held responsibilities for the management of large and complex multidiscipline projects, the overseeing of national and regional institutional reform programs, national and international urban management policy, higher education and training, and ministerial advice in several countries. Brian has also co-authored more than 100 publications and conference papers, including 10 books with contributions to the UN Habitat World Cities Development Report in 2011 and 2015. So obviously, Brian knows his stuff and has been working in this area for for some time. Let me now turn over to Professor Brian Roberts.
Hello everyone, welcome to this short presentation on the strategy guidance notes on urban governance prepared by the Committee of Experts on Public Administration. My name is Brian Roberts and I was one of the principal authors of this guidance note. I just want to spend a few minutes outlining the note and where you can get further information. I want to begin this presentation with a brief discussion on urban governance. Urban governance refers to how governments, in particular and stakeholders, decide how to plan and finance and manage urban areas. It's a continuous process. It involves a lot of contesting of the allocation of resources to different sectors of the economy. It's a very political process. However, it's no longer just the domain of governments. Increasingly, urban governance embraces engagement with business, civil society, and with international organisations, particularly when you're dealing with issues around climate change. The guidance note is presented under 6 sections. The first part develops our understanding of what urban governance strategy is from a historic to the current context. The second section looks at public sector situation with respect to the applications of urban governance, including broader applications involving public-private and community-based partnerships. The third looks at implementing urban governance strategy and provides some guidelines on this. 2 case studies are introduced, including references to many other case studies, peer-to-peer learning and research, and the final section looks at international development, cooperation and initiatives in the area of urban governance. There are many different stakeholders and other interests involved in urban governance strategies. These include state governments, local governments, civil society, central governments, international actors, and the informal sector. And depending on the nature of the strategy that's being formulated, be for a project or a program around urban development, urban management, the number of players involved will need to be considered very carefully. Urban governance strategy operates at many different levels and scales. At the local level, it may be concerned with a neighbourhood improvement scheme, how this is organised in partnerships between communities and local government. At the urban region, this will involve consultations with both local communities and with national governments, because there are issues of finance, laws, and other requirements to be taken into consideration. However, some elements of urban governance strategy will extend into the international sector. This may be in relation to dealing with UNESCO World Heritage Sites, the governance arrangements for that, and also how we localise the implementation of the SDGs. Urban governance strategy is complex and involves the integration of many different functions and societal interests. Urban governance strategies are required for many different purposes. Could be simply for integrated development plan for a region, or it could be for a national urban strategy. There are many types of urban governance strategies. All urban governance strategies end up with management arrangements which involve a composite of integrated and interrelated urban interests and responsibilities. The best way to approach the development and implementation of urban governance strategy is to use a systems approach, paying particular attention to multiple functions and responsibilities of agencies, organisations, and stakeholders and other party interests involved. There are 6 key urban governance strategy functions. These are shown in the left-hand column of the slide. More details about these are included in the policy note. It's important to link these functions to the organisations which are responsible for conducting various actions outlined in the strategy. It's also clear to outline the mandates and responsibilities of those organisations, such as the laws and regulations, the processes that are involved, and most importantly is to identify the capacities and capabilities and the resources needed to implement the governance strategy. The guidance note also includes some practical information. There are 2 case studies and a number of references to others on the web. The first case study looks at delivering metropolitan-wide business services in Verband-Stuttgart region of Germany. And the second is on governance arrangements for pooling metropolitan finance in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. There are a number of notes on peer-to-peer learning and research activities, including references to various institutions and organisations that have a key role in the research and development of urban governance services. And finally, the note refers to international development and urban governance cooperation, especially with international development agencies. Urban governance is becoming a matter of significant concern in the management of our towns and cities. It's no longer the domain or the responsibility of government. Business, community, and civil society interests are involved, and in some cases, the scope and scale of urban governance strategy will embrace international concerns and interests. I encourage you to read the publication, which is available on the UNDP Committee of Experts for Public Administration website, full stop. I thank you for your interest and attention in the presentation today.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Roberts, who has spoken on the topic of strengthening urban governance. We now turn to a next topic, which is strengthening municipal finance and local finance systems. And I have the pleasure to introduce our next expert speaker. Astrid Haas is an urban economist and adjunct professor at the School of Cities at the University of Toronto, extraordinary lecturer at the African Tax Institute, University of Pretoria, and research associate at the African Center for Cities, University of Cape Town. The strategic note that she tackled is on strengthening municipal finance and local finance. And Astrid is an independent urban economist working in both research and practice, supporting cities around strategy generally and specifically to strengthen their financial systems with a focus on unleashing new opportunities for subnational financing. She is currently an extraordinary lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria, as mentioned earlier, and a fellow at the Infrastructure Institute of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. In addition, Astrid has worked extensively with city governments across Africa and Asia in her diverse roles, including previously as an urban economist with the African Development Bank and policy director at the International Growth Center. So it is a pleasure for me to turn over the floor to our next speaker, Professor Astrid Haas.
Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm glad I could join you today for the discussion. So I'm going to be talking about the SEPA strategy guidancing note on strengthening local and municipal finance systems. And the context for this note is that there's been multiple mega trends that have shaped the globe over the past decades, but two most notable ones is one, extensive decentralization that has taken place. That means now that more than ever before, we need to engage, empower local and municipal governments to be able to achieve the SDGs. And secondly, particularly across the developing world, is urbanization. In particular, the African continent is urbanizing at a rate that we've never seen before. And to be able to manage this urbanization and to unlock its benefits in terms of livability, productivity, and sustainability, this requires mega investments, which in turn requires financing. And so this is why the New Urban Agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Plan for financing the SDGs call on the urgent need to strengthen municipal and local finance systems. I will just share my screen so that you should now be able to see the presentation. So municipal and local finance systems outline public spending, revenue raising, and borrowing requirements. And this is encapsulated in a sound public financial management structure as depicted here on this slide. This is to ensure that revenues and expenditures match in a way that allows both for fiscal discipline, but importantly allows for effective, efficient spending. And the key components of this public financial management system is something that I will now go through briefly in this presentation, but which you'll find more detail and illustrations of in the respective guidance note. So the foundation for this is a capital investment plan, as well as an annual budget. These two pieces outline the planning and prioritization that local and municipal governments have. A capital investment plan, the first piece, is typically a multi-year rolling plan that is approved usually annually by some form of governing body. It shows the costs and sources of funding that are required for the key components of expenditure within a local and municipal government. And importantly, it helps the local municipal government prioritize where it needs to spend in an era of tight financial resources. Prioritization is important. Most importantly, this prioritization should be shaped by the needs and preferences of the local populations that it's serving. Another important reason to have such a plan in place is that it signals to external financiers and investors what the priority is that local municipal governments are looking for spending. As noted, the second foundational piece is the budget, which outlines the resource requirements to be able to achieve these priorities, these spending priorities. How local governments will engage in the budgeting process will very much be defined by prevailing legislation within the country within they operate. But in most cases, they will have some role to play in developing their own budgets, particularly on an annual basis. And usually these will then need to be adopted and approved by some form of higher level of governments. The budgets themselves have specific components, revenues, expenditures, and borrowing, perhaps the most notable ones. Underpinning a sound budget, but also a capital investment plan, is the need for data. And this is where, in many cases, local municipal governments are not as strong. And the type of data that is required is not only one that is of a sufficient enough granular level that it can help governments make decisions, but that is also collected on a regular and timely basis. And this has three primary inputs: people, technology, and of course, information. Onto the specific components of the budget. So first of all, there is the revenue side. This is how cities and local governments raise money to fund their expenditures. Revenue assignments, so what type of revenues municipal and local governments can raise, will be assigned by legislation, and this will be divided by the different levels of governments. Local revenue policy is the one that really focuses on what local governments themselves can raise. And this involves a series of policy choices. It includes, for example, determining what the base unit is in terms of to whom they are going to raise this from. Is it going to be from a person? Is it going to be from a business? Is it going to be from a property, for example? Who should set the rates and taxes and what those, rates for taxes and what those rates should be? Whether there are any exemptions, for example. And then the actual monies raised, so once the policy has been set, are very much determined by the administration and management of the revenue system. So how identification, billing, collection, and enforcement are done. One of the most important components of revenues for most local and municipal governments, particularly in developing countries, are intergovernmental fiscal transfers. These are revenues that are collected at a higher level of government, and then, so usually a national or state level, and then apportioned and transferred to local governments. Given these make up an important component of the source of funding for lower levels of government, important considerations need to be put in place and important policies on how, first of all, the division of these transfers takes place between different jurisdictions, and then how the actual transfer takes place in terms of the timing, the frequency, etc. And so a strong intergovernmental fiscal transfer system will be one that is transparent in the way that the revenues are allocated. It's predictable in terms of the size of the allocations that are going to take place and where it has a regular timing, so that local and municipal governments can adequately plan taking these revenues into account. Own source revenues are revenues that are exclusively within the remit of local and municipal governments. Again, what these are will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and sometimes even within jurisdictions. So in some countries, that different forms of local and municipal governments have different abilities to collect different own source revenues. the ones, as a best practice, the revenues that should be assigned to a local level are the ones that can most be effectively administered at that level and will not foster competition between jurisdictions. Therefore, it is argued by many, particularly economists, that the property and land taxes are possibly one of the best and most promising sources of revenue for local municipal governments if administered properly. Also because their efficacy has a clear link to the local infrastructure and services that are provided. Particularly in developing countries, however, property and land taxes are still underperforming compared to their potential, both as mentioned previously, due to sort of policy considerations on how they're on how they're set, but also administration considerations on how they are effectively collected. Another source of local revenue are usually what we term sort of user fees. This can incorporate a number of different type of fees, tariffs, levies, licenses. User fees still make up a relatively low percentage of subnational revenues in low-income countries, as demonstrated on this slide, and so have a lot of potential. But they also need to be set in a way that doesn't exclude people from consuming necessary and necessary goods and services for living. So, for example, water. Or when it comes to other types of user fees, for example, business licenses, don't discourage investment into a local jurisdiction. Finally, the impact of all of this, which is also outlined in the guidance note, is that if local municipal finance systems can be improved and strengthened, some of the demonstrated benefits include sustainable implementation of the SDGs at a local level, a reduced need for these subnational governments to be dependent on their national counterparts. It can help sort of foster local economic development and economic transformation. And importantly, in the era of the climate crisis that we're in now, it can also support much more localized environmental sustainability, as well as climate actions towards mitigation and adaptation. Importantly, perhaps most importantly, as demonstrated on this slide, it reinforces the link between local finance and service provision, improving accountability and strengthening the local social contract, which, if done well, can unleash a virtuous cycle by unleashing further financing and funding for local and municipal governments. So I invite you to read the strategy and guidance note and to reach out if there are further questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Haas. Lots of food for thought on strengthening municipal finance and local finance systems, actual practical tools such as land taxes, property taxes, and many other issues such as local revenue capacity management, which Professor has touched on, and a very useful resource, I must say, for this particular area. So now let me turn over to the third presentation and introduce the third speaker, who will be focused on enhancing local capacity for prevention, adaptation, and mitigation of external shocks. We have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Alan Lavelle, who was born in England and has lived continuously in Latin America for 50 years. He is the author of the strategic note on enhancement of local capacity for prevention, adaptation, and mitigation of external shocks. He has a PhD and MSc in economic geography from the London School of Economics and the Political Science, LSE, and a specialist in urban and regional development. Since 1989, he has been dedicated to the study of disaster risk and climate change and its management. Currently an associate researcher at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Costa Rica, he has been a professor and researcher at the University of London, Middlesex University, the Metropolitan Autonomous University of Mexico, and UNAM, the Central American Superior University Council, and the University of Costa Rica. He has written more than 150 chapters, articles, documents, and scientific books on the topic of risk and disasters and urban development, and has given more than 150 international conferences in 42 countries around the world, and has carried out nearly 90 consultancies in 32 countries on 4 continents. I would not be surprised if Professor Lavelle also worked on the Philippines, which has its own share of natural disasters and shocks. But first, before turning over to Professor Lavelle, let me extend our deep thanks to him for joining us even at this ungodly hour in Costa Rica. We are keeping up Professor Lavelle late today, but we very much appreciate that he has engaged us for this particular presentation. Without further ado, Professor Lavelle, please.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. When you're 80 years old, you don't sleep very much one way or another. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's been a pleasure to listen to the other presenters. I'm luckily, because of Brian's presentation, don't have to introduce the structure of the document. The structure of the 4 documents was very similar, so I don't have to go into that. And luckily, because of a presentation by the other 3 people, Astrid, Brian, and Paul, much of the opportunities, challenges, needs to be faced in order to do what we want to do have been discussed in those documents. So there is a transverse nature of their knowledge into a particular topic, which is the one we're dealing with. So what I'm going to try and do in the 10 minutes available is to firstly look at the challenge we're facing, secondly look at the context in which this occurs and the rationale for local government to be present, thirdly the mechanisms by which one can intervene the problem we are studying and wishing to get on top of, and the last one is the difficulties and opportunities, which, as I say, the other 3 paper producers have in fact dealt with, because of much of what they say there is what we have to apply to this particular problem. In terms of the challenge is how we can move from basically a reactive state in terms of shocks, disasters, and risk, that is, humanitarian response, reconstruction, early warning, to a prospective or anticipatory fashion. That is, anticipating risk and dealing with existing risk by reducing it, or by avoiding or limiting the growth of new risk in the future, by working on hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and capacity. And this is a severe challenge because there's very little invested in this topic worldwide. All of the data show that 95% of all investment in this topic goes to response and other associated achievements, and not to reducing or controlling risk in the future. So this is basically the challenge, and how localities are critical in intervening the process by which risk is constructed. And here it is absolutely fundamental to understand 2 things. Risk and disaster are not natural, and the use of natural disaster we've been trying to get rid of for years, but still keeps raising its ugly head and avoiding, in many ways, a clear understanding that risk is socially constructed, according to the practices of individuals, communities, families, governments, private sector, etc. And that does not deny the importance of the hazard event, but in terms of a risk we can control, it is socially constructed. So that is part of the challenge. How do we move to a more proactive and more anticipatory stage in terms of reducing risk at the local level? Why the local level? What is the context in which we're working? Nowadays, it's completely accepted that risk and disaster and the impacts and the growth of loss and damage is increasing more than arithmetically. All of the statistics show this. A good part of this risk is being created in the urban environment, particularly in cities less than 500,000. It is consolidated in metropolitan areas as well. Consequently, we have to get on top of this, otherwise the whole humanitarian response thing will be impossible, as it is today, to manage with sufficient financial resources and capacities. Why local? if we consider disasters, and there's a nomenclature which is flowing around now of intensive, extensive disasters and risk. What are we talking about? Intensive disasters and risk is large-scale events which occur very infrequently, but lead to massive losses in one particular point in time, and many times are very spatially circumscribed in major metropolitan areas, etc. On the other hand, we're talking about extensive risk, which is the recurring occurrence of smaller scale events, which accumulatively in terms of the impacts can probably be greater than a large event that occurs every 50 years. Whether it's one or the other, in the end, a large disaster covering a large spatial extent is a sum of local disasters, because in the end, in the same way as we have raised the level of the locality to being important in disaster response for first responders, in terms of risk reduction and risk control, the locality has to be the one on top of the very particular conditions which create the risk, which leads to the loss and damage which is suffered. And this can vary enormously in a very small spatial extent. With 5 kilometers distance between two communities, you can have very varied levels of risk according to what happens with vulnerability, exposure, hazard, and capacity. And so basically, local has to be on top of both response and increasingly, we would hope, in terms of a control of the factors which lead to risk. These named risk drivers, the underlying causes of risk, which derive from unsatisfactory, skewed, non-complete, incomplete, or whatever terminology you wish to use, development processes in a wide sense of the world. Mechanisms to getting on top of this are basically mechanisms which have been around for a long time in the development sphere, but they must be fine-tuned to account for disaster risk conditions in localities. Here, localities is a complex word to use in many ways, because we're not sure, according to which countries you're dealing with, whether we're dealing with subnational units, which can be states or even provinces, or are we dealing with communities, or are we dealing with cities? Basically, we're dealing with subnational units, and predominantly with urban, given that the world is now 52% urban, Latin America is 82% urban, and Africa is growing rapidly to a far higher urban status in the future. Mechanisms must get on top of what we call hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and create capacity. We normally associate disaster risk reduction with reducing vulnerability, but it's much more than that. Reducing exposure will come through things that are practiced at a local level or should be practiced, like land use planning, territorial organization. Reducing hazards, you can't obviously reduce natural hazards because they occur naturally, but you can reduce what we call socio-natural hazards, which are born in the intersection between society and environment. And with environmental degradation, for instance, cutting down woodlands on slopes in cities, or reducing the natural protection which the environment offers, you create new hazards of landsliding or flooding, etc. And with vulnerability, it's obvious to do with sustainable development, increasing livelihood opportunities, etc., service provision, and others. And so there is a very big environmental management context. But on the other hand, there are all series of things which lead to risk in the city, generated by local risk creating processes that have to be controlled through local planning processes. At the same time, we should also accept that risk expressed at a local level in a particular urban centre, in a particular community, is not only the result of local processes. It is many times created by national or international processes. There are cities that grow very rapidly because of the location of inbound plants on the frontier of Mexico, in Honduras, areas which I know well, where the cities simply don't have the capacity to absorb that growth and provide services, security, adequate infrastructure, and consequently external processes promoted by national governments lead to the creation of new risk conditions in localities. And so we have to be able to, in some way, get on top of what we would call local risk-generating processes associated with land use, corruption, problems of urban rent, the problem of who earns from selling urban land, the access of poor populations to adequate urban land. But we also have to deal with what is the external influence from international and an internationalized economy. And here we realize that risk is increasingly transnational and internationalized. So in terms of mechanisms, there are numerous. Most of them, I will go back to the phrase that they are traditional development practices and methodologies which have to be adapted to and incorporate risk reduction ideas. And this includes public investment facilities, etc. In terms of, and I will finish here, in terms of the difficulties and the opportunities, as I say, Astrid and Brian so far have put forward a whole series of things that have to be done. And these can be applied to the disaster risk reduction scheme, as well as they can be applied to many other problems of urban and local societies. And Paul will talk about this in the idea of fiscal decentralization after, so it's not necessary to go into the detail. Are dealing with is enhancing capacities in the sense of being able to do, that is to plan, to elaborate plans for getting finance internationally or nationally, to generate ideas in terms of national and local revenues which can be used, in terms of capacitating people to control land use, control building materials in particular locations, etc. And so the whole thing of enhancing the capacities is both financial and capacities in terms of being able to do. And we know very well in determined circumstances, because of the low level of local finance available, the low levels of transfer from national governments, inaccessibility to international funding, that a lot of localities, municipalities, small cities, in fact, cannot do this. They just do not have the capacity to do it. And unfortunately, it's those that are most in need that have least capacity to, in fact, find these sources of support. So I will finish there to be within the 10-minute time frame. And having done this spontaneously, then I'm happy that I got here in 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Lavelle, and you did it excellently and in a very engaging way. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to your presentation. You talked a little bit about shifting from reactionary to anticipatory strategies for disaster risk management. And of course, this brings back to my mind this study I encountered on the damage from earthquakes. And there was a calculation that in areas with that scores more poorly on governance, you have more damage and more mortality. And that clearly relates to anticipatory efforts to prevent the kind of risk realization that we've been seeing in different parts of the world. I stand corrected. Professor Lavelle is actually not in Costa Rica right now. He is in Panama. But that is not much of an improvement for Professor Lavelle's situation because it's still around 3 a.m. in Panama. So
It is an hour later, in fact, so that's lucky.
Thank you so much for staying up for us, Professor Lavelle. And clearly your intervention is a very great one. Let's take advantage of, let's put a stop here a little bit, put a pause, take advantage that Professor Lavelle is still with us for a few more minutes. I have a question here, Professor Lavelle, as well as a quick reaction. Let me go with a quick reaction first in case you wanted to hear it. One comment received, I am from my little experience in my country, Cameroon, I think intensive sensitization needs to be carried out for the population to gain consciousness of what DRR is all about so as to know their role. During an awareness campaign, we talked to the population about the importance of free runways for rainwater. And as we were departing, the same population continued to dump their refuse on road gutters and river channels. So clearly, a greater realization of what another speaker talked about was systems realization, that if you contribute to the risks, then you will basically suffer from the consequences of the natural disaster. Let me turn over to a question for Professor Lavelle.
Can I just interrupt? Yeah, I just laid out that the use of the word natural disasters is prohibited by UNDRR and is used throughout systems. There are no such thing as natural disasters. There are natural hazards. They are socially constructed. And if we do not realize they're socially constructed, you'll think they're just natural and they're going to happen. So you have to respond to them. Sorry, but we take at 80 years old, having 30 years been predicating for this, we still keep hearing it from the press, from government, from international organizations, and it gets us nowhere in terms of reduction.
Thank you for interrupting me, Professor Lavelle. That is an excellent point. And in fact, confuses us on the communication of these disasters if we call them natural. So in fact, they are very much man-influenced and in many ways man-made. So let me turn to the question. This could also apply to the other speakers. In your experience, Professor Lavelle, what enabling conditions and practices can be done to use subsidiarity for good local governance in the context of disaster response and recovery in conflict-ridden, post-conflict areas in particular?
Well, I've not worked particularly in conflict areas, although Latin America is increasingly conflictive, Venezuela, Honduras, etc., etc. This remits to the idea of complex risk and complex disaster, that it's not just a matter of an earthquake affecting an area. When an earthquake or a flood affects an area like Ethiopia and like Libya recently, the big flooding associated with the two dams that broke, but in a conflict area where there's two governments and their governance problems which are serious, then we go back to what was called complex emergencies or complex disasters. And consequently, I think what it does bring to the forefront is the need for more holistic and more complex understandings of things. It isn't just an earthquake affecting a society or a flood. It could be an earthquake, a flood, and a hurricane all at the same time or sequentially. It can be complicated by political turmoil or by political conflict, etc. So we really have to work to more holistic approaches and understandings of these things. And that means putting it right in the center of development concerns, not looking at it as a disaster risk management sector separate from and the ability to integrate with. No, it is part of the ADN DNA of development, is risk reduction, risk control. And if we don't see it that way, we're going to stay with 4% of all investment in the topic of disaster in risk reduction and risk control. And that's not sufficient.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Lavelle. A few more questions here. Let me turn over to this question. How can anticipatory action help to prevent the loss and damage affected by natural hazards?
Well, anticipatory action is now one of these complex additions to the whole terminology. It's just come on board, anticipatory action, as when a disaster is announced because of better abilities to have prognosis of events, then is putting up front things which allow communities to not suffer as much residual risk as before. But that is not the same thing as anticipatory action in a sense, but you avoid that residual risk in the first place. Consequently, early warning and anticipated action, which the Germans in particular through G7 last year have put on the table and is growing enormously, is one more aspect of ex post reaction. It is not previous disaster risk reduction in structural terms. It is, of course, fundamental, important, but what is important is that type of action and early planning and response and rehabilitation and reconstruction, recovery and resilience and adaptive social protection include components which promote ex ante real disaster risk reduction in structural terms. And so we have to use those 96% of funds being dedicated to ex and ex post reaction to reduce risk structurally in the future by working with communities, community participation, educational processes, understanding how risk is built up in society and how communities contribute to their own risk, how others contribute to their risk, and that they can do something about it, hopefully.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Lavelle. Hence the importance of decentralization in the local context in sort of connecting the dots on that. There is one last question here, and then we promise to let you go finally.
I'll go back to bed.
The capacity of local entities are relatively low on account of financial resources, technical knowledge, and scope of assignments. I think you talked a little bit about some of these jurisdictions. How do these entities assess those risks then, if those are the constraints that they also face? And often we see in the literature and in development practice out there that the most the communities that face the most hazards are also the ones that need the most help. So what can they do?
Yeah. Well, the first step into anything about reducing risk, managing risk, responding to risk is understanding risk. That is risk analysis, but crossed over not with the idea of pure quantitative analysis that says you are at risk, blah, blah, blah. It is understanding risk as well, why that risk exists. Yeah. And there isn't finance for that in a lot of places. And precisely the challenge is so great that you have to finance the understanding of risk, then you have to finance the intervention in that risk, the control and the evaluation of the efficacy of your measures, etc. And when you have a world in which, for instance, the city of Copenhagen has probably got $25,000 per capita local resources generated locally, and a city in Africa, Latin America, or locality has $2 per capita per year. And of course, we're talking about inability because of lack of finance, but we should not blame lack of finance for lack of action. There are many things in governance that can be done. For instance, if we consider prospective management, that is avoiding risk in the first place, that does not require big investment. That requires controlling land use patterns, building controls, etc. It is not a matter of large financial outlays. And so we should be moving towards prospective management. The cities that have 500,000 today, when they grow to 5 million in 20 years or 30 years, if they have the level of risk which those that exist today have, we're in a real serious problem. Well, we're in a real serious problem now. We will be in a more serious problem in the future.
Thank you so much, Professor Lavelle. Until now, I'm getting more and more questions channeled to me, but I believe we did promise to let you go and go back to bed, essentially.
Well, you can let people send me the questions. I will answer them. I still have I only sleep like 5 hours a day. That's because of age. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Lavelle. We'll move on now and turn over to a next presenter. And yes, Professor Lavelle, we will send you the questions. And thank you so much again for engaging our participants in that extra manner. Take care, sir. So our next presenter, I have the pleasure of introducing someone who will speak about fiscal federalism and decentralization. And I'm a little familiar with his work, having followed it some time back when I was still serving with the United Nations Development Program. So Professor Paul Smoke is the author of the strategic note on fiscal federalism and decentralization, which was prepared for this event. Paul Smoke is a professor of public finance and planning and director of the PNP MPA in New York University, where he teaches courses on public finance, development planning, governance, and development assistance in developing countries. Professor Smoke's research and policy interests include urban and regional development and the political economy of fiscal reform and public sector decentralization. So we will learn a lot from these areas. He previously taught in the International Development Program and chaired the Master in City Planning Program at MIT. And he worked as a resident policy advisor with the Harvard Institute for International Development in Kenya and Indonesia. Professor Smoke is a senior research associate at the Overseas Development Institute in London and serves on the Economic Advisory Council of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the advisory board of the Local Public Sector Alliance. Without further ado, let me turn over to Professor Smoke's presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Smoke. I'm at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University, and I'm going to share with you some comments today on fiscal federalism and decentralization. I'm sorry I can't join you, but at least I have an opportunity to talk to you. I'm going to use this PowerPoint presentation, and this will help us to stay on track, and you'll also have a record of the notes and things that I may not be able to cover. So public sector decentralization, of course, has been a prominent phenomena throughout the world, although it happens in quite different ways in different places. And low and middle income countries pursue decentralization with a varied objectives. They want to improve public management, governance accountability, stronger economic growth, have more efficient and inclusive service delivery, promote peace and stability, and so forth. The attainment of these goals from decentralization is based on expected greater subnational government knowledge of local conditions and needs and their closer proximity to local people compared to central governments. Part of the rationale for decentralization and the idea of subsidiarity, going as low as you possibly can with service assignment, is a public finance theory known as fiscal federalism. I'm going to say a few words about fiscal federalism. This looks like a complicated diagram, but it's actually not. The traditional public finance theory says that there are three major roles of government in public finance: stabilization of the macroeconomy, distribution so that you're getting resources out to the right places, and hopefully helping some of the poorer places to get resources that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And these are primarily central functions, but the allocation function, which is about service delivery and the use of resources, follows the principle of subsidiarity, go as low as possible. And again, the reason is of that proximity of local governments, of subnational governments to people, and understanding the context better. So there's a set of economic principles in fiscal federalism that help us to think about what functions and finances should be assigned to subnational governments. But the principles themselves are kind of textbookish, and they need to be applied in political and institutional context in the real world. By doing this, we can figure out which local functions belong at the local level. And one of the key principles of public finance is finance follows function. So after you decide what subnational government should be doing, then you decide what types of finances they should have. Local own source revenues that they have some control over, intergovernmental fiscal transfers that help to meet the gaps that they have in financing they can raise on their own, and to meet other other national goals that are important for the nation as a whole, and subnational governments might not have the resources to provide on their own. And then, of course, loans for development finance, both market loans and subsidized loans, can be an important part of how to finance development. And there's also the possibility that in either the delivery of services or in the generation of revenues, that there could be some private sector role. Now, the problem is that this all sounds fairly simple, but there are these various aspects to an intergovernmental fiscal system: expenditure assignment and management, local revenue generation, which local governments need some autonomy over in order to be responsive to their populations. There's intergovernmental transfers to make up for the fact that central governments have a much better ability to generate resources than subnational governments, and these can be unconditional, that the local governments can decide what to do with, or conditional. And then, of course, local government investment finance and borrowing, which in developing countries often includes donor funds. So these things have to work together because, for example, if you create an intergovernmental transfer that creates disincentives for local revenue generation, then you're going to skew the mix of resources that are available to local governments. And beyond these fiscal elements, fiscal is only one piece of decentralization. There is an absolute need for appropriate administrative and political decentralization to manage the fiscal resources and to be accountable to local populations. So this slide looks at the fiscal decentralization situation and trends, and you'll see that high-income countries have higher shares of subnational government expenditures as a share of GDP than low-income countries. They have larger public expenditures, 28% of public expenditures versus 12% in low-income countries. They're responsible for more public investment, 44% versus 18% in low-income countries. And richer countries raise a lot more total tax revenue, 19.7% over 4.4%. They are more comparable in terms of their dependence on revenue, but in most other aspects, low-income countries and some lower and middle-income countries also do not play the same kind of role as in other places. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the implication of the current situation in the last slide is that reforms are needed in order to be able to strengthen the subnational fiscal position in low and lower middle income countries. But the problem is that how to do this depends on the context. There's no best assignment of subnational government functions and revenues. You use the principles from the theory, but they have to be applied to be compatible with economic, institutional, political, and cultural context. We also know that there are implementation challenges. There are economic realities. Poorer countries have limited and narrow economic bases, pervasive poverty, and so forth. There is less good information and empirical evidence regarding what works in lower income countries, and you need information and evidence in order to develop good policies. There's a variety of capacity constraints that we're all familiar with, technical, managerial, and governance. And there are political realities at the national and subnational level. Some actors at the national level don't want to decentralize, don't want to give more powers to subnational governments. And some subnational governments may not want to accept them because they're happy to be subsidized and supported more by the central government. Now, in order to actually move forward with the use of fiscal federalism to create better decentralization, the problem is that the reforms that are needed are demanding and can rarely be done at the same time. And this means that we need a strategic implementation strategy in order to begin to build the system as per the principles and the context of the country. And that involves determining appropriate starting points. What is feasible to demonstrate progress now, and how can the path for the sequencing of reforms build on those starting points? It can often be a good idea to consider the use of piloting and experimentation. So you're not jumping in with a big reform, you're testing things before you actually make them part of national policy and mainstreaming the reform design. Sometimes you need to create appropriate incentives. That it is not necessarily true that all local governments will want to accept these reforms. And so the government can create incentives that help to convince them that they should try these things. And then once they try them and they work, then there's a possibility for them to be institutionalized. We also know that capacity development needs to be part of this process. A lot of the capacity development in low and middle income countries is classroom textbook learning. And then local government officials go back to their local government and have to put out fires and can't can't apply the things that they learn. So it's really important for capacity to be on the job, on the ground, and directly relevant to the functions that subnational governments are trying to do better right now. Another important point is to adopt an ongoing learning and adaptation approach to intergovernmental fiscal reform. Often reform programs start, but they don't work, but changes aren't made. And it's really important to monitor and evaluate, to make changes, to accept that you've made mistakes and there's ways of doing things better. And a final point here is how to work effectively with international development partners who are interested in providing support for decentralization. Often they are, but they have their own ideas, their own ways of doing things. And the countries who are, if they are really to benefit from the support of these organizations, they have to be partners in working with the international development partners to be able to develop a program that is going to work in their country, that is going to generate some change. And ultimately, that change, if this is done properly, can be sustainable and create much better situations for local governments and their constituents.
Thank you very much, Professor Smoke. I guess that concludes Professor Smoke's presentation. It's my pleasure to now begin to conclude our workshop. I think we've had the past 2 hours been fed with a lot of resources, information, and expertise. Thanks to our colleagues in UNDESA for organizing that collection of presentations and collection of experts. I've been given the difficult task of synthesizing all of this information. I will not even attempt to do that. I will just raise a few ideas that I sort of heard from the last 2 hours as our way of concluding. Assistant Secretary General Hanif and Honorable Romina Khurshid Alam and Mr. Tapan Mishra, our UN Resident Coordinator for Mongolia, all 3 interventions talked about the importance of decentralization, as well as the political will that seems to be given now to this approach in pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's very good to hear this because a lot of lessons from the past few years, including the pandemic response of many countries, where the front lines of pandemic response were really the local governments. As Governor Dax Cua of the Philippines emphasized, the future is local. So the strategy itself hinges on that decentralization. We then went on to a follow-up session in the workshop that focused more on the technical experts that we invited, the authors of the strategy notes that we have shared with you. So Professor Roberts talks about urban governance is complex and collaborative, and therefore a systems approach is needed. And we're hearing and sort of understanding this systems approach, the importance of that systems approach in many levels in the past, in the interventions of the past 2 hours. In particular, the role of citizens themselves, in understanding how these disasters are in many ways not natural, as Professor Lavelle reminded us all. There is no such thing as a natural disaster anymore. They have to do and link with the risks that man has also created, and therefore policy has a big role to try and anticipate those risks and try to reduce them. Professor Haas, I enjoyed your presentation because it talked about practical tools we can pursue in fiscal federalism. And I won't sort of belabor the point on the usefulness of these many tools. Professor Lavelle, as I mentioned, talked about moving from reactive to anticipatory. He emphasized that natural disasters do have very much a man-made component. And even in places with less resources, there are many things that local governments and local communities can do in order to help manage the risks related to disasters. And finally, Professor Smoke talked a little bit about fiscal federalism, the politics of this, the political economy of this, and the need for a strategic approach to build this, to strengthen this at the local level. And of course, that has to do with the rebalancing between central and local powers, as well as central and local public finance. All very much food for thought for all of us participating in this workshop. So I'll leave it there. I know I probably would not have touched on many other ideas, but the recordings, I understand, are going to be presented by UNDESA and shared with all of us. And these resources made available to all colleagues who participated. Feel free to send us your questions on this, and our colleagues in UNDESA will help facilitate. Now I have the pleasure of turning over to Anna Thorland. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you. And once again, thank you, participants, for your attention and significant number of questions. Special appreciation to our guest speakers, experts, and the fantastic moderator, Dr. Ronald Mendoza, for making this webinar so engaging. And thank you to each one of you. Good afternoon.